The cold in Marcus Thorne's office was a special kind of manufactured chill, the sort that cost a fortune in climate control to remind visitors of the vast, indifferent distance between him and them. For Daniel Peterson, standing on the plush gray carpet that swallowed all sound, the cold was a living thing, seeping through his worn work jacket and settling deep in his bones. It was December 23rd. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window, the city was a frantic constellation of Christmas lights and last-minute shoppers, a world of warmth and cheer that felt a million miles away. Inside, there was only the sterile hum of the building's ventilation and the quiet, predatory stillness of the man behind the sprawling mahogany desk. Thorne didn't look up. He was signing a stack of documents with a heavy, gold-nibbed pen, each stroke a deliberate display of power. Daniel's gaze drifted to a framed photo on the credenza. Thorne with his perfect wife and two beaming children on a ski slope, their expensive winter gear a uniform of effortless privilege. Daniel's own daughter, Lily, had a coat with a faulty zipper he'd spent an hour fixing just that morning. "Peterson," Thorne said, his voice as smooth and hard as the polished stone of his desktop. He still hadn't made eye contact. "We're making some structural changes. Streamlining." You understand? Daniel didn't understand. He'd been with Thorne Logistics for 3 years, ever since his own garage went under, buried by a mountain of medical debt. He was a warehouse foreman, and he was a good one. He was never late, never complained, and knew the inventory system better than the software developers who'd designed it. He simply nodded, his throat too tight to form words. Thorne finally looked up, his eyes a pale, disinterested blue. "Your position has been deemed redundant. Effective immediately." The words hung in the airless room, clinical and brutal. Redundant, like a faulty part in a machine. Thorne pushed a thin envelope across the vast expanse of wood. "Your final paycheck." Human Resources handled the paperwork. Daniel knew, without even looking, that the Christmas bonus he'd been counting on to buy Lily a proper gift and stock their pantry for the holiday week wouldn't be in there. He'd been counting on that money with the quiet desperation of a man running on fumes. "Sir," Daniel began, his voice raspy, "it's 2 days before Christmas. My daughter." Thorne held up a perfectly manicured hand, cutting him off. "Your personal circumstances are not a factor in corporate restructuring, Peterson. Security will escort you to your locker." The dismissal was absolute. The humiliation was the point. The entire warehouse floor could see him through the glass walls of Thorne's office. A fish in a bowl, being gutted. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of pity and fear. If it could happen to Daniel, it could happen to any of them. That was the message. Daniel picked up the envelope. His hand didn't shake. He met Thorne's gaze, and for a fleeting second, the despair in his gut hardened into something else, a core of cold, quiet dignity. He didn't plead. He didn't rage. He simply turned and walked toward the door, his back straight, feeling the weight of every silent stare from his former colleagues. The security guard, a young man named Kevin who Daniel had often shared a coffee with, looked genuinely sorry. He didn't say a word, just walked beside him, the jingle of his keys a funereal rhythm marking the end of Daniel's world. He cleaned out his locker, a worn paperback, a framed photo of Lily with a gap-toothed smile, and a thermos, and walked out into the biting December wind, a redundant man in a city sparkling with false promise. The walk home was a blur of biting wind and blurred festive lights that seemed to mock his despair. Each cheerful wreath on a lamppost, each string of twinkling bulbs framing a shop window, felt like a personal insult. He clutched the thin envelope in his pocket, its contents a pathetic testament to 3 years of loyal, back-breaking work. He knew Thorne. He knew the man's reputation for cutting corners, for squeezing every last cent from his suppliers and his employees. The redundancy was a lie. Daniel had overheard conversations, seen altered shipping manifests. Thorne was skimming, cooking the books to fund his extravagant lifestyle, and Daniel's firing was likely a convenient way to trim payroll before the year-end accounting, or perhaps to remove someone who, in his quiet way, saw too much. But knowing the truth didn't matter. He was powerless. The system was built to protect men like Thorne and crush men like him. As he walked, his mind drifted back, a defense mechanism against the crushing present. He remembered the smell of his old garage. Gasoline, hot metal, and honest sweat. He remembered the satisfaction of diagnosing a tricky engine problem, the grease under his fingernails a badge of honor. He had been his own boss then, a master of his craft. He and his wife, Sarah, had poured everything into that business. It was meant to be their future, the foundation for their family. Then Lily had gotten sick. The first diagnosis was a storm cloud, the second a hurricane. The garage was sold to pay for treatments. Then their savings were drained. Then Sarah's wedding ring. He'd fought for her, for them, with everything he had. But in the end, the illness had taken Sarah, leaving behind a void that still ached in Daniel's chest and a mountain of debt that had forced him into the fluorescent-lit world of Thorne Logistics. He'd taken the job for the steady hours, the mediocre insurance, the ability to be home every night to make Lily dinner and read her a story. He'd swallowed his pride and traded his skills for a paycheck, all for her. He had promised Sarah on her deathbed that he would always take care of their little girl. Now, walking through the indifferent city, that promise felt like a lead weight in his stomach. He was failing. The thought was a physical pain, sharper than the winter cold. He was a mechanic who couldn't fix his own life, a father who couldn't provide for his child 2 days before Christmas. He finally reached the 3-story walk-up he called home, the brick facade grim and streaked with grime. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath, trying to arrange his features into a mask of normalcy. He couldn't let Lily see his despair. She was only 7, but she had her mother's perceptive eyes. She would know in an instant that something was terribly wrong. He had to be strong for her. He was all she had. He opened the apartment door and was greeted by a wave of stale, cold air. He'd kept the heat turned low to save money, a constant, nagging economy that now felt like a profound failure. The small living room was tidy but threadbare. A tiny, lopsided Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with a string of dimming lights and a handful of handmade ornaments Lily had crafted from paper and glitter. It was the best he could do, but seeing it now, it looked fragile and sad, a symbol of their meager existence. Lily was sitting on the floor, wrapped in a thick blanket, drawing in a coloring book. She looked up when he came in, her face breaking into a radiant smile that momentarily banished the gloom. "Daddy, you're home early." Her voice was thin, and a slight, dry cough punctuated her sentence. The cough was a constant companion, a reminder of the lingering respiratory issues left over from her illness. "Hey, sweet pea," Daniel said, forcing a smile that felt brittle. He knelt and hugged her, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the simple, clean scent of her shampoo. For a moment, he could pretend everything was fine. He was just a father, home from work, hugging his daughter. But the illusion shattered as he pulled away and her bright eyes searched his face. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her smile faltering. "You look sad." He couldn't lie to her, "Not really. Just a long day, baby. Mr. Thorne is making some changes at work." He chose his words carefully. "I'm going to have a little holiday vacation." He hated the lie, hated the taste of it in his mouth. He opened the refrigerator. A half-gallon of milk, a few eggs, a jar of pickles, and a single lonely apple. The cupboards were no better. A box of macaroni and cheese, some rice, and a can of tomato soup. This was it. This was all they had to get them through Christmas. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. The check in his pocket would barely cover the rent due next week, let alone groceries or a present for Lily. She'd been talking for weeks about a specific art set she'd seen in a store window, her eyes lighting up with a creative fire he hadn't seen in a long time. He'd promised he would talk to Santa about it. Another broken promise. He felt the walls of the small apartment closing in on him. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator and Lily's occasional cough. He was adrift, cut loose from the one mooring that had kept him stable. He looked at his daughter, so small and trusting, her world entirely dependent on him, and felt a wave of shame so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here and let the despair consume him. He needed air. He needed to think. "I'll be right back, sweet pea," he said, his voice strained. "I just need to run to the corner store for a minute." He grabbed his jacket. The feeling of the thin envelope in the pocket a constant, painful reminder of his new reality. The corner diner was called The Daily Grind. A greasy spoon with cracked red vinyl booths, and a perpetual smell of burnt coffee and fried onions. It was a place for people whose lives were on the skids, a temporary refuge from the cold. Daniel slid into a booth in the back, the worn vinyl sighing under his weight. He ordered a black coffee he couldn't really afford, just to justify his presence. He needed a moment to think, to strategize, but his mind was a maelstrom of fear and failure. He pulled the envelope from his pocket and laid it on the table. He tore it open. The check was for even less than he'd expected. Thorne had docked him for 2 sick days he'd taken last month to rush Lily to the clinic when her cough had worsened. The cruelty was breathtaking in its pettiness. He was left with a handful of crumpled bills in his wallet. $47. That was it. $47 to get him and his daughter through Christmas and into a new year with no job and no prospects. He stared into the black, bitter coffee, the reflection of the flickering fluorescent lights wavering on its surface. He felt invisible, erased. Just another piece of human debris washed up in a forgotten corner of the city. Then he saw her, an elderly woman, sitting alone a few booths away. She was trying to be discreet, but he could see her counting out loose change from a worn coin purse, her brow furrowed in concentration. She pushed the small pile of coins toward the waitress. "Is this enough for the soup and a roll, dear?" she asked, her voice frail. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, looked at the coins and then back at the woman with an expression of deep sympathy. "You're about $1 short, hon," she said gently. The woman's face fell. The look of quiet, profound disappointment on her face struck Daniel like a physical blow. It was the same shame he felt, the same humiliation of being found wanting in a world that demanded more than you had to give. He watched as she slowly, painstakingly, began to gather her coins back into the purse, her hands trembling slightly. In that moment, something inside Daniel shifted. His own despair was a vast, bottomless ocean, but seeing hers, so stark and immediate, sparked a flicker of defiance. He couldn't fix his own life. He couldn't stand up to Marcus Thorne. He couldn't give his daughter the Christmas she deserved. But he could do this. He could do this one small thing. He got up, walked over to the counter and laid a $20 bill down. "For her meal," he said quietly to the waitress, nodding toward the old woman. "And add a piece of pie, whatever she wants. And keep the change." The waitress looked from the money to his face, her expression softening with understanding. Daniel didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't want to be seen. He walked back to his booth, leaving his own coffee untouched, and slipped out of the diner, the bell above the door tinkling softly behind him. He was now down to $27, but for the first time all day, the crushing weight on his chest felt just a little bit lighter. He hadn't bought a meal. He had bought back a piece of his own dignity. He didn't know he'd been watched. In a corner booth, shrouded in shadow, a man sat nursing a cup of black coffee. He was a large man, built like a mountain, with a long, gray-streaked beard and hands that looked capable of bending steel. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He wore a heavy, patched leather vest, the insignia of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club prominent on the back, though it was obscured by the high back of the booth. His road name was Preacher, a moniker earned not for religious fervor, but for his quiet, observant nature and the uncanny wisdom he sometimes dispensed. Preacher had seen Daniel come in, had recognized the look on his face. It was the look of a man who'd been kicked to the curb by the world, the same look he'd seen on the faces of countless broken men, some of whom now wore the club's patch. He'd seen the envelope, the despair in Daniel's eyes as he looked at the check, and he had seen the entire exchange with the old woman. He saw Daniel's quiet calculation, the internal battle, and the final, selfless act. It was done without fanfare, without any expectation of reward. It was an act of pure, unvarnished character. Preacher knew of Marcus Thorne. He'd seen the man's smug face in the local business journals and had heard the whispers from disgruntled truckers and warehouse workers who drank at the same bars as some of his brothers. Thorne was a leech, a man who built his fortune on the backs of others and discarded them when they were no longer useful. To see this man, Daniel, stripped of his livelihood by a snake like Thorne, use what was likely his last dollars to preserve the dignity of a stranger, it resonated with Preacher on a primal level. The club had its own code, one misunderstood by the outside world. It wasn't about lawlessness. It was about loyalty, respect, and a fierce, unwavering refusal to let the world break you. It was about protecting your own and standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Daniel Peterson, in that one quiet act, had shown more honor than Marcus Thorne would possess in a dozen lifetimes. Preacher watched Daniel leave, then pulled out an old, scarred flip phone. He dialed a number from memory. It was answered on the first ring. "Yeah." A gravelly voice grunted on the other end. "Sledge?" Its Preacher. Sledge was the chapter president, a man whose authority was absolute. "I'm at the daily grind. I just saw something." He didn't elaborate on the details. He didn't need to. Sledge trusted his judgment implicitly. "Yeah? What kind of something?" "The real thing," Preacher said, his voice low and certain. "A good man getting crushed by a rat." Marcus Thorne. A low growl rumbled through the phone. Thorne's name was known. "Where?" Sledge asked, the question sharp, decisive. "Thorne Industries building. The glass tower downtown," Preacher replied. "The man he fired just spent his last $20 to buy an old woman a piece of pie." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, a silence heavy with understanding. "Tonight," Sledge said. It wasn't a question. "Tonight," Preacher confirmed. He hung up the phone. The waitress came over to his table. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked. "No, thank you," Preacher said, laying a 50 on the table. "This is for you. And for what you saw. Good people need to know they're seen." He stood up, his full height and breadth seeming to shrink the small diner. He walked to the door, the weight of his presence turning heads. As he stepped out into the cold night, he knew the word was already spreading. A text message, then another, then a dozen calls. The gears of the Brotherhood were beginning to turn. Tonight, justice wasn't going to be blind. It was going to arrive on two wheels, wrapped in leather and chrome. The first sound was a whisper, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the very bones of the city. Marcus Thorne, working late in his penthouse office on the top floor, dismissed it as a passing truck. He was finalizing a deal, moving assets to an offshore account, the final move in the corporate maneuvering that had made Daniel Peterson's job redundant. He felt a smug satisfaction. It was a clean cut. Business was unsentimental. The whisper grew into a rumble, then a roar. It wasn't a single sound anymore, but a chorus, a symphony of internal combustion that shook the double-paned glass of his office window. He stood up and walked to the window, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. What he saw below made the blood drain from his face. It wasn't one truck. It was motorcycles, dozens of them, then 100, then more, pouring into the streets surrounding his building from every direction. They moved with a disciplined, almost military precision, their single headlights cutting sharp, predatory beams through the darkness. They were Hell's Angels. There was no mistaking the Death's Head insignia, the sheer, intimidating presence of the riders. They weren't riding through. They were stopping. One by one, they parked, forming a perfect, impenetrable ring around the entire city block. They filled the street, the parking garage entrance, the plaza in front of the lobby. A wall of chrome, steel, and black leather. Then, in near-perfect unison, the engines were cut. The sudden, profound silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. The streetlights glinted off polished handlebars and the studs on leather jackets. 200 men sat on their machines, silent, motionless, their faces unreadable behind beards and sunglasses, their collective gaze fixed on his glass tower. Thorne's heart hammered against his ribs. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. Was this a robbery? A protest? It made no sense. He had no dealings with these people. They were thugs, criminals, a lower form of life he paid his security teams to keep away from his polished world. He grabbed his phone and frantically dialed the head of his security. "There's a gang outside," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "Hell's Angels. Hundreds of them. Do something." The guard's voice on the other end was tight with fear. "Sir, they're not doing anything. They're just sitting there. I don't pay you for them to just sit there." Thorne shrieked. "Get the police down here. Get them out of my street." But he knew, even as he said it, how useless that would be. This wasn't a riot. It was a siege. A quiet, patient, and utterly terrifying display of power. He was trapped. The Brotherhood had arrived. A silent, judging jury, and the trial of Marcus Thorne had just begun. From his perch in the sky, Marcus Thorne watched in disbelief as 2 police cruisers arrived, their flashing lights looking pathetic and small against the sheer mass of the biker encampment. The officers got out of their cars cautiously, not with aggression, but with a palpable sense of wariness. They approached a single, massive figure who had dismounted and was standing near the building's main entrance. It was Preacher. Thorne couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the body language. Preacher wasn't yelling or threatening. He was speaking calmly, gesturing occasionally toward the building. The police officers were listening. They were actually listening to him. A local news van, drawn by the police scanners, pulled up a block away, not daring to get closer. A reporter and a cameraman got out, the cameras light a bright beacon in the tense darkness. This was a nightmare. His carefully curated image was being shattered in real time. Down on the street, Preacher was telling the story. He told it to the 2 police officers, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried the weight of conviction. He spoke of a man named Daniel Peterson. He described the public firing, the cruelty of it just before Christmas. Then he told them about the diner, about the old woman with her handful of change, and the quiet, dignified act of a man who had nothing, giving what was left of it to someone who had less. "We're not here to cause trouble, officer," Preacher said, his gaze steady. "We're here because we believe in respect. We believe a man's character is measured by what he does when no one is watching. We saw what happened. And we don't think a man like Marcus Thorne should get to sleep well tonight while a good man like Daniel Peterson wonders how he's going to feed his little girl on Christmas." The news reporter, sensing a story far more compelling than a simple gang gathering, edged closer with her microphone. Preacher turned his calm gaze to her. He repeated the story. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stated the facts. And his words, broadcast live, began to dismantle Marcus Thorne's reputation brick by brick. The story acted like a signal flare. A few of Thorne's other employees, leaving for the night and seeing the spectacle, stopped. Emboldened by the biker's silent, protective presence, one of them, a young woman from accounting, approached the reporter. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Mr. Thorne has been falsifying shipping invoices for months. He fired my supervisor for questioning it. He fired Daniel because he was too honest." Another man, a forklift operator, came forward. "He cut our overtime and safety benefits to pay for the new marble in the lobby. We're just numbers to him." The truth, suppressed for so long by fear, was finally coming to light, illuminated by the headlights of 200 Harleys. Daniel Peterson's story was no longer just his own. It had become the story of everyone Thorne had ever stepped on. The reveal wasn't happening with a bang, but with the steady, undeniable power of spoken truth, protected by a silent brotherhood of leather and steel. The news report spread like wildfire through the city's late-night currents. It was on every television, every social media feed. The image of the silent, stoic bikers surrounding the glittering tower of a corrupt CEO was cinematic and powerful. The story of Daniel Peterson, the fired single father, and his simple act of kindness was the human heart of it all. People weren't afraid of the bikers. They were cheering for them. Meanwhile, a small group of riders, led by the chapter president, Sledge, had quietly detached from the main group. They didn't go to Thorne's office. Their business wasn't with him anymore. They had found Daniel's address through a friend of a friend who worked at the courthouse. They pulled up to his rundown apartment building, their engines cut to a low, respectful idle so as not to wake the neighbors. Sledge, a man whose presence was an event in itself, walked up the 3 flights of stairs alone. He knocked on Daniel's door. Daniel opened it, his face etched with confusion and fear. He saw the Hell's Angels patch on the massive man's vest and his blood ran cold. He thought he was in some kind of trouble, though he couldn't imagine how. "Daniel Peterson?" Sledge asked, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate in the narrow hallway. Daniel nodded, speechless. "My name is Sledge. Preacher saw what you did at the diner tonight. And we know what that bastard Thorn did to you." He paused, his eyes, surprisingly gentle, meeting Daniel's. "The world needs more men like you, and it needs fewer rats like him." He didn't offer pity. He offered something far more valuable, respect. "We run a custom auto shop. Restorations, fabrications. It's honest work. We need a foreman. A real mechanic who knows his business and isn't afraid of hard work. The job pays double what Thorn ever gave you, with full benefits for you and your daughter. It's yours if you want it." Daniel was stunned into silence. He couldn't process the words. A job. A real job doing what he loved. Sledge seemed to understand. He just nodded. "Think about it. We'll be in touch." As he turned to leave, he gestured down to the street. "My boys and I took up a collection. For Christmas." Daniel looked out his window and saw a line of bikers. One by one, they were walking up to his building's entrance, leaving behind grocery bags overflowing with food, brightly wrapped presents, and a single, thick envelope that they placed carefully on the top step. The community, awakened by the news, began to respond. The owner of the Daily Grind showed up with 3 hot meals. Daniel's landlord called and told him not to worry about January's rent. The bikers didn't need to use force or intimidation to ruin Marcus Thorn. They had simply held up a mirror, and the entire city, including his board of directors, saw him for what he was. His ruin was complete. But for Daniel, it was a resurrection. He watched the bikers leave their gifts, their acts of gruff, profound kindness, and felt a dam of emotion break inside him. They weren't just giving him food and presents. They were giving him back his hope. They were recognizing his worth when the world had told him he had none. The sun rose on Christmas morning, casting a soft, clean light over a city blanketed in a fresh layer of snow. Inside Daniel's apartment, the air was warm for the first time in months, filled with the smell of bacon and fresh coffee. The small living room had been transformed. The floor around the lopsided tree was buried under a mountain of gifts. The kitchen counters were laden with enough food to last for weeks. It was a scene of impossible abundance, a miracle delivered by an army of unlikely angels. Lily's laughter, pure and unrestrained, was the most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard. She was tearing open a gift to reveal the deluxe art set she had dreamed of, her eyes wide with a joy so profound it made Daniel's chest ache. There were new clothes, books, and toys, more than she had ever received in her life. For the first time since Sarah had passed, the apartment felt full, not with things, but with a palpable sense of peace and security. Daniel sat on the floor beside her, a mug of coffee warming his hands, simply watching her. The desperation that had been his constant companion for years was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady gratitude that felt foreign and wonderful. He was no longer a victim. He was a man who had been seen. He had a future again. A real job, working with his hands, building and fixing things. A chance to provide for Lily, to give her the stability she deserved. Later that morning, as Lily was busy drawing with her new colored pencils, Daniel stood on their small, rusted balcony, looking out at the transformed world. The snow muffled the city sounds, creating a serene quiet. He thought about the events of the previous night, the roar of the engines, the silent vigil, the quiet knock on his door. It was still hard to believe. It felt like a dream, a strange, gritty fairy tale where the knights rode motorcycles and wore leather instead of shining armor. Then he heard it, a familiar, low rumble, distinct and solitary. He looked down to the street below. A single Harley-Davidson was parked at the curb. Sledge sat astride it, looking up at him. He wasn't there to talk. The time for words was over. He simply raised a gloved hand and gave Daniel a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture that transcended language, a sign of deep, mutual respect between two men from different worlds, now bound by a shared code of honor. Daniel raised his coffee mug and nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the incredible gift he had been given. Sledge revved the engine, a powerful, throaty roar that echoed in the quiet morning air. It was no longer a sound of intimidation. It was a promise, a sound of loyalty, a sound of belonging. As the motorcycle disappeared down the snow-covered street, its rumble fading into the distance, Daniel Peterson felt the last remnants of his old life fall away. A new chapter had begun, one built not on corporate ladders and false pretenses, but on the solid foundation of dignity, respect, and the fierce, unexpected loyalty of a brotherhood he was now a part of. The roar was gone, but the echo remained, a permanent fixture in the landscape of his reclaimed life.